Beware! Beware! Today we're going to get spoopy and talk about how you can scare the shit out of your players. Greetings gamers, I'm Anto and I need you to make a wisdom save. And today we're going to be talking about how to run a horror themed game and how to ramp up that tension in your session. So let's get to it. This video is sponsored in part by the adventures from the Potbellied Kobold, now on Kickstarter. More on them later. Even if you're not running a horror-themed game like Vampire the Masquerade or a horror-themed module like Curse of Strahd, injecting horror elements into your game can be a lot of fun, especially during this most spoopy of time of year. So today I want to tell you about my approach to horror. First, let's talk about why you want to introduce horror elements into your game. Of course, the obvious answer is to be scared and feel that fear, but why? I would argue the main reason to play horror-themed games is because probably more than any other genre, horror is excellent at giving that wave of rise in tension and then the release or resolution. We feel that tension rise and we get scared to the point where it doesn't feel like we can take it anymore, and then we get that flood of adrenaline from our fight or flight reflex kicking in. Then we get that wonderful sensation of relief when the horror is resolved and our body realizes we aren't about to die. Be warned though! For some people, horror is a hardline topic and they don't want to experience it. And lots of people have different types of horror that they're not comfortable with. So as always, make sure to talk to your players and find out what they're comfortable with. And if you're running for younger players especially, tailor the kind of horror to your audience. With that out of the way, let's dive into what you can do to spook your players and give them a satisfying experience. Now, D&D isn't mechanically built to be a horror game, and it might not actually be the best system for you to use, especially for a horror-themed one-shot. We could spend hours talking about the dedicated horror games out there and how they do things better than D&D, but that's not why you've clicked on this video. You want to know how to use D&D for a horror game. So the thing you need to understand is that whether or not the players and characters feel horror in D&D comes solely from you as the DM. There aren't really mechanics that fully convey the fear we're going for within Dungeons and Dragons 5th edition. Sure, there's the frightened condition that gives disadvantage and won't allow a creature to move towards the monster, and that can certainly help the players feel desperate that they might not win a fight, but it's not going to make them feel actual, genuine fear. No, the most powerful tool at your disposal for making your players poop their pants with fear is description. In a horror game, long, intricate descriptions help you build that tension with your players. When in a normal game, you might say, you walk down the stairs into a basement corridor and you see the door at the end stands ajar. In a horror game, you'd say something like, as you make your way down the rotten wooden stairs, each creak of the step beneath you rings out in the corridor below. In what little light is left from the room above, you can make out a dark stain at the base of the stairs. Your hand brushes over deep gouges in the banister, feeling splinters that have been pulled up. You can smell a mix of wet earth and something metallic. And as you move forward down the corridor, you feel something wet and tacky beneath your feet. As the last of the light from the room above fades, you see what looks like a shape at the end of the corridor before it's swallowed by the darkness. Drawing out the descriptions increases the unease in your players as they wait for the inciting moment when everything changes. They know it's coming, they understand that at some point something will happen, but their unease comes from that anticipation. Which is one of the reasons detailed descriptions work so well here. Another thing that detailed descriptions achieve is it allows you to immerse your players using all of their senses, and it allows you to connect those senses and let the players draw conclusions based on the information you give them. In the description I just gave, on the way down into the basement, the player saw a stain at the base of the stairs. Combine that with the tacky feeling of walking over it and the metallic smell in the air, they're probably going to assume that that stain is blood. But combine that with the gouges in the banister and suddenly you have the image of a person trying to flee up the stairs and being pulled back hard enough to leave gouges in the wood. So with all that fresh blood, where's the body? There should be a body, right? With no body, the unease turns to dread as they move further away from the light above until at the very last moment before being plunged into darkness, they see something. Another trick I like to deploy to help ramp up the tension in my game is the slow then fast rule. The basic idea is that you use the slow description to build that tension and ride the wave up, and then to make things move really fast downwards towards the resolution. Doing this means the players don't get the time to adjust to the changing situation, and it helps elicit more of that fight or flight response. Using that previous example, I would take the time to slowly and deliberately describe the details of the scene until the players reach the door, and then I would move quickly and have something happen, either a scare or a combat, and I would use much shorter, punchier language so that they don't have time to absorb every detail, and it helps to simulate that sudden rush of adrenaline channeling. Before I tell you the rest of my tips for running horror, I want to let you know about my Patreon page. Over there you'll find all sorts of game aids, organisational tools, and homebrew adventures, including the Stalker of the Drift, an ice-themed adventure that would work really well with horror elements, and it would fit in perfectly into an Icewind Dale campaign, for example. The link to the Patreon is in the description, so go and check it out. Thanks, I love you. Now back to the video. Now you've probably seen it said a million times before that in horror you shouldn't show the monster, or that good horror shows the monster as little as possible. And there's a reason that this gets brought up so much. A monster on its own isn't frightening. It can have traits that frighten us, and it can do frightening things, but once seen, a monster can't be unseen. And by keeping the generator of your horror out of sight, your players can fill in the gaps. When it comes to the description of the monster, wherever possible, stick to vague descriptions. Unlike with atmosphere, where more is more, with your monster, less is more. General shapes, the way it moves, the sounds it makes, these are all better things to describe than the monster itself. When the time has come to finally reveal the monster in its full glory, then you want to go back into your detailed descriptions, which build the sense of dread in your players. Building off the idea of the monster being unseen, shapeshifting can actually add a huge shot of unease into a horror game. If the monster can be anyone, it creates a level of paranoia that I love in players. I once replaced the party wizard with a doppelganger, and the paranoia that created was amazing. You can hear all about that story up here. Now, over the years, I've found one trick that works really well when it comes to maintaining the tension and the dread of a horror game within combat, and that's to adjust the monster's profile or just have the monster break the regular rules of the game. Think about most horror stories and most monster movies. The creature is able to do things well beyond our protagonists, whether it's walk on ceilings, shapeshift, or have superhuman strength. In a game like D&D, a lot of the things that a monster can do, our heroes can also do. So I find that we need to add in some extra spice to make up for that disconnect. That might be doubling the creature's speed so it feels fast and lethal, or it could be giving it resistances that make it feel like an unkillable beast. But sometimes the only way to get that feeling that you want is to break the rules. Now in 5th edition you can actually achieve this without breaking the rules because you can give a creature legendary actions. Legendary actions allow your creature to act outside of its own turn and at the end of another creature's turn, and that can really ramp up the difficulty and the terror of a monster. Players get used to the usual order of things. They get to act, the monster gets to act, and then they get to act again. But having a monster disrupt their carefully laid plans can really put the players on the back foot. If the players have planned to work together and organise their attacks throughout the turn, and after the first player acts, the monster immediately restrains them, that changes the conditions of the entire fight. It forces them to adapt and change their strategies, which helps to build that tension of a combat because it's not going how they expected. One of my favourite things to do is allow monsters to use their legendary actions to disengage. Allowing a monster to dart into and out of combat and strike from the shadows can help make it feel much more dangerous. And if they can just get into combat and then before any damage really gets done to them, just leave, that makes them much more threatening. Now we need to talk about setting up for your horror session, because the setup for the session will make a big difference on how you approach it. I break my horror settings into two broad categories, the hunter and the hunted. As the hunters, the players will be tracking down the monster, following clues and leads and discovering information. This is the perfect setup to have your finale in the monster's lair, where it can use lair actions and add even more terror to your play. As the hunters, your players will be filling a very active role, and the story of the session will be dictated by the choices that they make. But then as the hunted, the players will be trying to escape or survive. This could be a chase where the players are being pursued by the monster, or it could take place in an isolated location where the monster strikes from the shadows and tries to pick them off. As the prey, your players are taking a much more passive and reactionary role, which can really add another layer of tension to their experience because they don't have that control. One of the most powerful tools in your horror toolbox is to use your players' fears against them. This is another case where you'll want to have a conversation with the players ahead of time to make sure that they're actually okay with this, but it can be an excellent way to heighten the unease that they feel in the session. If you have players who are frightened of spiders, for example, your monster could assume a spider's form, or even drive masses of spiders before them as those arachnids are trying to flee from the monster. You do want to be careful with this and make sure you speak to your players beforehand, because playing on some of these real phobias can have a really strong reaction from players, and not always in a good way. So it's definitely something that you want to bring up beforehand, but if everyone is okay with it, absolutely lean into it. I talk a lot about quick and short notice prep on this channel, which is why I'm really pleased that this video is sponsored in part by the adventures from the Potbellied Kobold. This book is a collection of short 5th edition adventures written by some of the biggest names in the industry, and it's intended to be useful no matter what your campaign setting. If you find yourself without a plot for this week's game night, being able to grab the adventures from the Potbellied Kobold book and pick one of the adventures within is going to really lower your stress levels as a DM. The book has been designed to be super runnable with plenty of tips on how to make the adventures fit into your world. And the character of the Potbellied Kobold is an adorable through line to connect all these adventures together into a longer narrative. The book includes the adventures, but it also includes art, maps, and new monsters to include in your game, as well as suggestions on monsters from the monster manual and several third-party products that would fit well into the adventures. The Kickstarter is running until November the 7th and is already fully funded with plenty of awesome stretch goals to unlock. You can also find a free sample adventure on the Kickstarter page, which is linked in the description below. So be sure to check out the adventures from the Potbellied Kobold, and thanks again to Jess Stevens Games for supporting the channel. Outside of the game mechanics themselves, there's a lot you can do to get your players into the headspace to be afraid. So much of horror is cerebral and psychological, so you want to help them get into the right headspace. Simply dimming the lights and playing some eerie music can go a long way, but if you want to go the extra mile, there's all sorts of things you can do, from setting up lights to flash on and off to accompany the sound of thunder, to putting yourself into grotesque makeup that elicits that visceral response. Props can go a long way as well. A box or a container filled with cotton wool that's been pulled apart can easily represent a hole in a wall filled with cobwebs that the player's got to put the hand into to solve a puzzle. All of these things build on top of each other layer by layer and help you get the players into a headspace where they are scared. Even just straight up telling the players, look, this is a horror game and you should be scared, can really help them get into that thought process and help them react appropriately. I'd love to hear what tips you have for running horror games down in the comments below, and you can check out my doppelganger story video right here. But until next time, happy gaming.